The focus of my research was on whether or not a specific set of improvised weapons systems were a causal factor behind the transition of sub-state armed groups in Syria and Iraq from highly asymmetric forces engaging in attrition warfare to more conventional forces engaging in maneuver warfare like modern state militaries. So in the early 20th century, these groups could gradually make that transition if they captured enough territory and equipment. But today's immense capability gap between state forces with access to modern air power and advanced weapons made that less feasible. So now the contemporary understanding of sub-state armed groups since 9/11 has typically been one in which they are much more asymmetric and reliant on attrition warfare. But the more recent success of groups like the Islamic State has sort of begun to challenge that notion. The improvised weapon systems that I chose to look at for this research were up-armored suicide vehicle-borne IEDs, or SVB IEDs, improvised unmanned aerial systems, or improvised UAS, and improvised rocket-assisted munitions, or IRAMs. The large-scale innovation, production, and use of these systems in Syria and Iraq has led to a lot of work focusing on them, but the vast majority of it is more technical and doesn't look at them as causal factors in that broader transition that I was talking about. So I chose to answer this question using a comparative case study of 4 groups operating in Iraq and Syria. Hayat Tahrir Hashem, which is that was previously Jabhat al-Nusra, or the Nusra Front, which has been on the news. The Islamic State, Ansar al-Tawhid, and Ansar al-Islam. The primary data source that I used was weapons imagery released by the groups themselves. So over the last 2 years, I've been building this data set of weapons imagery gathered from extremist media outlets and social media. I went through this data set by watching, which is like just watching all major media releases that each group has released since they entered into Syria, which is where I bounded the project. And to identify when usage of these systems began and ended and how they were being employed on the battlefield. So then I used similar methods to determine when they transitioned to and from being a conventional or asymmetric force. And then I compared the time periods, and that analysis was supplemented with secondary source research to construct the cases. So my hypothesis was that there was a causal effect on the transition, and that it was similar in importance to territorial acquisition. The findings of my imagery analysis are displayed on the graphs in the middle of my poster. In analyzing my results, I found it was necessary to differentiate between basic and advanced territorial control. So both provided an area where a group could operate freely, stage attacks, and have defined front lines. But only advanced control allowed for the exploitation of resources and infrastructure in an area. So advanced control is established by being the dominant actor in that area. And this applies to HTS since 2012 and the Islamic State since the end, during the Caliphate period. But not the latter 2 groups in my sample, as they both operate fully on HTS-dominated territory. It was also necessary to define the production requirements of improvised weapons. I saw as the analysis went forward, as they determined what level of territorial control is required to use them, with advanced control being necessary for improvised weapons with high material requirements. The analyses of these of each system's requirement and effects are displayed in that grade table in the bottom right. Based on the results, my hypothesis was partially supported. Improvised weapons can be a deciding causal factor behind the transition in some cases, but at least basic territorial control required in all cases. So improvised weapons are not as important. When advanced territorial control is achieved, improvised weapons were not causal in the transition because advanced territorial control was always achieved in conjunction with significant conventional weapons captures, which was enough to transition without improvised weapons. And in these situations, improvised weapons were still used, but that use was governed by local necessity from things like shortages in certain wilayat, in the case of the Islamic State, and their really powerful enhancing effects like those of suicide car bombs, like SVBIDs. Improvised weapons had a causal effect when only basic territorial control was achieved. Ansar al-Tawhid's entire operational profile has become sort of this low-intensity conflict standoff force now because of their unique IRAM arsenal. And Ansar al-Islam is able to use their closest analog to precision strikes because of the ISR from their improvised UAS, which is shown in the imagery on the upper right. In contrast, while the Islamic State has de facto basic territorial control, much more than Ansar al-Islam has, in parts of the Syrian Badia, they have reverted to this sort of hit-and-run style attrition warfare tactics. The glaring difference that I saw in this research between the Islamic State and the other groups with only basic territorial control is the lack of improvised systems or any UAS footage in their media releases since spring of 2019, when the last village of the Caliphate was captured by the SDF. The comparison also suggests that improvised UAS operating in an ISR role may have the most powerful enabling effect of any system in this study. So based on these conclusions, future research should focus on smaller groups with varying levels of territorial control and access to improvised systems, particularly improvised UAS.